Should I remove those? Is it bothering you?
No, no, don't worry. Good evening, friends. It gives me immense pleasure to invite Naveen among this. I teach journalism, and one element in my classes which I incorporate is from his publishing school's methodology. His publishing school is committed to tell people not to look at one element of publishing, but look at multiple streams that comes into a bookmaking. Therefore, from designing to editing to marketing and the entire political economy of publishing are being taught to his students. This interlocking idea is extremely encouraging, and his publishing of Siegel has brought out some of the best authors of the world, starting from India's own Rumila Thaparan, Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak to George Louis Borges to authors. You have the Siegel edition of them. He has also played a big role in dealing with the American University Press's idea of what becomes obsolete and what becomes accessible. Therefore, if they're hardbound or dated, he gets them and converts them into paperback and makes them accessible. Therefore, in that sense, he's a very, very interesting interventionist. And thank you for doing that. About a decade ago, you was here with KG Subramaniam. And when KG Subramaniam's work was shown, we thought that we should look into KG Subramaniam's wonderful pictorial work on emergency. This is about young Indira Gandhi becoming a princess and from princess as a dictator. Therefore, that entire transformation of Mrs. Gandhi was brilliantly captured by KG Subramaniam. And I thought that this work should be brought out in Tamil. And now I have the book in front of me, and he has given me the permission to do the translation in Tamil. Therefore, this very soon we'll do it in Tamil. Thank you again for this. One of the things what he believes is called publishing without borders. Therefore, we would like him to actually explore into this idea of what is publishing without borders, because in journalism we know about reporters without borders, and in emergency care there are doctors without borders. So what is this publishing without borders? We would like him to explore. Uh, I am quite convinced that vibrant democracy depends only on informed choices, and informed choices need informed public sphere. An informed public sphere generally comes with a big price. Therefore, if I want to bring out a very important book, I may not be in the bestsellers list, and I should be prepared to read the book and keep it in the ground for God knows how many years. But Siegel was never bothered about the pressures of the market. Siegel was committed to providing informed choices for our readers. Therefore, in that sense, you have done a service to our democracy. Thank you for that. Now, may I invite you to give a talk, please? Before that, I would like to invite our trustee, Mr. Balakrishnan, to hand over a book which you have published. It's a brilliant book which Mr. Balakrishnan did. It's on the issue of Indus Valley civilization.
No, you might want to be here, there, because I'll take the water. Oh, this is yours. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for both inviting me and the introduction. Very generous of you. Um, I'm a publisher essentially, and I also do other things. I take photographs, I write, um, and as I was telling a friend just now, that sometimes you wait for 30, 40 years to be discovered both as a writer and a photographer because you don't want to show your own work in your own gallery and you don't want to publish, so you wait to be discovered. And today I'm going to discover how patient you are because I was told that I should speak for 45 minutes and I have three. It's he's called it a triptych of ideas. It's basically three thought pieces on the idea of culture, the idea of justice, and on tolerance. So bear with me. And if I mumble, I have a young friend here, Parvati, who's going to tell me to go closer to the mic or not. You can hear me, I take it. Yeah? Okay. Mhm. I removed the mirror from the bowl, tested the hook, checked if it would take the weight, replacing it with my shadow, hanging it on the hook. Having done the exchange, what else would I call it? I looked into the shadow, and I found the mirror looking back at me. Turning away in surprise, I found myself looking into the eyes of my shadow. Only it wasn't looking at me over my shoulder. Yes, at the mirror, which no longer reflected the face of my shadow, for it wasn't there to reflect. Having myself removed it a moment ago, I found it hard to understand or explain, so I started all over again, this time making sure to get it right. I removed the mirror from the wall, checked the hook, tested it, making sure it would take the weight before taking off my shadow, hanging it on the hook, replacing one with the other, the shadow in place of the mirror. Having done this exchange, this bought, this trading, this swapping, this bold, even clever negotiation, this striking a deal, what else would I call it? I looked up at the mirror and found the shadow whispering my name. I sent this little prose text, poem, whatever you wish to call it, to my friend Romila Thapa. We write letters to each other, and she responded, "What is a shadow? Is it but part of oneself? Yes, up to a point. Or is it outside oneself? Yes, up to a point. Is it that which is part of oneself but keeps on changing its form as the light changes? So, what is it reflecting? And can these reflections have meaning, or are they completely at variance with oneself, as with the changing light? Is one shadow one's other being, sometimes visible and sometimes completely invisible, if not absent? Does one shadow help one to see oneself? Yes, up to a point. But does it help one to understand oneself? This is worth thinking about, said Rovila. This negotiation between the shadow self and the self as reflected being in the mirror, this to me is one possible idea of culture. there are others. I wish I could tell you that there was only one truth, a single solitary truth, the one we conjure up, magicians that we are of dailiness, morning, noon, evening, night, day after day, starting life as a figment, tiny seedling, our only truth. This one truth. It isn't. People are born into their versions of the truth. They live them every single day. In the confinement of their solitude, single, even troubled truth. Some do it with a degree of magnanimity about other truths, existing, breathing, living with what we call our lives. Not in a singular manner, plural, regardless of how unpalatable these lives, these breaths, these existences may be. Others are distressed, agitated, angered by the presence of parallel truths in their lives and in the lives of others. Other, always the other, hinting, condoning, pointing at exclusion. There is the truth of us. Therefore, there is the lie of the other. Because these do not match our own frames, or yours for that matter. You must arrive, I say, at an understanding of what works best for you, and like Lear, learn to live with difference. Remember, none of this is anything but an acquired skill. This learning tool is culture. Virasat, inheritance, an entire system of learning that makes mockery of a scientific way of imbibing things cultural, one that depends on memory and the circumstance of sensed impressions, customs, facts, and oral myths that are handed down and stories we enact as rituals and often pass on. This is a sharing across time, across generations. We all do it in some form or another. There is also a constant state of sharing that happens within us as individuals, like conversations with oneself. But then this act of conversing within the evolved self in our heads and hearts is not just confined to a monologue. There are multiple selves in an amalgamation of inherited memories within me, like a dead soul's archive. Relatives, families, friends, and what of the many literary experiences that form layer after layer of, yes, certainly imbibed culture in the form of our reading lives, thus inheriting others and their cultures. This is a particular interest to me as a publisher. There are many ways a child will come to learn his mother's tongue, the language of birth, spoken from a far-off place, while the protective cocoon of the womb holds it secure, but allows it to listen, even to every single murmur. Every whisper finds its way to the child's heart, though it's yet to be formed ears. Later it will hear, before it begins to speak. I first learned the language of my mother spoke on her lap, more specifically in Kashmir, even more precisely while I slept. In fact, the first words that reached me were not spoken words. They were sung. I heard songs, as murmurs, as whispers, as lullabies, as language that soothes and invites the welcoming night to a child's tired eyes, that it may sleep and rest. These were the night sounds, the ones that lulled me to sleep. The morning song was different. It had a baser timbre to it, a fine, deep-throated song that flowed effortlessly from my father's throat, not directed at me. This was something he did. He sang while he dressed for work. It wasn't a mere hum. It was popular music of the time. It was Kundalal Sehgal's ghazals, C.H. Atma, Talat, Suraya, Noor Jahan. It was the songs that heroes and heroines of the black and white era sang to each other, expressing emotions of love and anger and happiness and sorrow and despair and heartache and joy and devotion and war and famine and death and just about every emotion known to mankind. He seemed to know them all. Later, the film folk from Bombay discovered Kashmir. My father, as assistant manager and host at the Royal Palace, would invite the Kishore Kumars, the Talats, the Nargises and Sunil Dutts, the Padmini and Ragni sisters, the Raj Kapoors, the Simis, to his humble quarters at the foot of the hill just above the hotel's rooms and vast lawns. My mother's tomato pulao, kheer, gajar ka halwa, and being discovered by the visiting stars who will be relaxed after a hard day's shoot and happy to unwind and make themselves at home. Sitting on our mats and eating from our thalis, the evenings would begin and end in song, singing swaris at home, sleeping in her lap, comfortable, secure, drifting back to memories of time before I was born. I would listen from afar, even as I fell asleep. Years later, I would remember the songs and the ghazals. More importantly, I would hum the tunes. Later, much later, I would begin to speak Hindi and Punjabi and bits of Urdu. Even later, the nuns at Saint Presentation Convent in Kashmir would take me into their charge and teach me a whole new language, English. I am a publisher, one who has learned to disrespect the notions of boundaries as we know them, not out of a sense of arrogance or I know better. No, out of reasons that are political, as most things these days need to be, and yes, cultural. Always cultural, our baggage. Boundaries, man created, nation made. To me, the idea of culture travels, translates, turns the reality of its own self, the one it began with, into the reality of the one defined by our idea of culture as the other. Instead of opening up possibilities, we set up nation states that ghettoize the book, make it a commodity to be hounded, chased to the ground, bought and sold across territories, across languages, like literary slaves. I guess what I'm attempting to express is that in this, our world of publishing, too much time, energy, money is spent on creating structures that ultimately box us in. And yet these precise boundaries do melt and blur when so many emotions springing from what you do, what we do, the way you do them, the way we do them, the tingle and the excitement of the words we find, translate, secure, bind in the nicest possible manner for a community of interested readers who don't really know, or if they did know, they don't always give a damn about labels and territories, knowing very little about how a book makes its way into their hands, as long as it continues to do so with regularity that can only be described as unrelenting and reliable and timely. Through the written, spoken, felt word, I have tried, however tangentially, using poetry and distractions to suggest the idea of culture. But remember, it is after all a slope made slippery as you climb. the idea of justice. Exploring the oft-used term bearing witness, proactive, as in seeking the atrocity and recording the circumstance and effects of it immediately, as in while the events unfold and the mind has had no time to adjust, cope, begin to understand that which it is experiencing. And over time, say 21 years later, 40 years later, 75 years later, the partition is still being misunderstood. Journalists do this, writers, poets, painters, photographers, citizens who see themselves as ordinary folks and who are thrust into history as it unfolds do it. They had no choice, this last category. Involuntary bearing, the weight of this unfolding, being witness to it. And yes, historians do it. You know all this already. When I take photographs or write my poems, I am engaging with the possibility of giving vocabulary to that which I witness. I may be using the word within quotes the way you would use evidence. Your discipline teaches you to study the traces as historians, the ones that are all around us, sometimes hard to decipher, at other times bristling with restlessness to be imbued with voice. In my case, the restlessness is key. My urge to create through my practice of photography, images, text, some kind of a response to what happened in Gujarat, for example, post Godra, not to find answers, but to help me deal with this moment of personal and national shame, an urge to document. Without fully understanding the weight of an overwhelming tragedy, there is no game plan at the time of execution, nor time, just urgency. But there is thought, that which allows me to think, maybe even reflect. To borrow, rephrase, ruminate in a Hannah Arendt-like manner, where she suggests that to think is vital, essential, necessarily more important than to reason. Particularly in these times when those that lead teach us to reason, to be convinced about their reasonable reasonings and blindly follow the unreasonable. Or to put it bluntly, follow the unethical. To create an enemy within. And so many histories have done over the last 7 decades here. And over there where it all began. The lesson our masters imbibed from that architect of the other, the one that made evil look ordinary, banal, as Hannah Arendt would go on to say. The unethical made ethics, made belief, made crusade, made that which needed to be eradicated. My only grouse with the word banal is that it is no longer adequate in the way it describes evil. In the cannibal times, evil is deliberate malice because it is in the hands of a powerful government legally elected. And therefore, battling it with reason, as most tend to do, is just no longer an option. So back to thinking in the dark times, or the need to move beyond thinking, reflecting, heart and soul, the knowledge that thinking can only take us thus far. Let go perhaps of thought, or its plural that holds us back, makes us hesitate. To reflect the intuitive is to listen to your inner voice, that which recognizes the ethical without necessarily having to debate it, that which makes us stand up and simply say, No, no longer will we accept this. Socrates, the good life must have reflection as a part of its goodness. The unexamined life is not worth living. The role of innocence is another problem. Innocent bystander is no longer acceptable. You cannot remain in a state of innocence any longer. Again, previous cannibal times have seen these very same problems for the recorders, the bearers of histories. The ethics of innocence. What does it mean to be an innocent bystander in the presence of atrocity? To actively choose not to risk limb, even life, not mere incarceration, as in being sent to jail, but also the fear that your lack of innocence, as in your intuitive action in the face of injustice, may cause you physical harm, makes people stay in a constant state of the inactive. You're afraid to act live, to resist actively, regardless of what may. Struck me that often we're on the outside looking out, while the permutations and combinations of what we have come to recognize as circumstance extend themselves into an indecipherable truth, as in the numbers failing to match. This matchlessness in itself may not be of consequence, as our lives continue to sway and bend and work out ways of resisting the vagaries of the which way do the winds of time blow. The surprises that an unfolding history, as it records itself, has in store for us are nothing compared to the shocks we get from each other, each human other. How just or ethical is it for those in power, in majority in greater numbers, to create the imagined fear of the other as vermin, to be hounded and crushed, cockroaches of history? Again, we know about this from other genocides, the pettiness, the aggressive tendency towards violence, the ensuing melancholy, the despair, and the matchlessness or misfitness of human nature at its mean best. Manipur, a reminder of how history is thrust upon us, turning us all into mute witnesses. Eventually, we will justify, explain, rationalize, accept this cleaner version of history. But is there ever something called a just genocide? In Verify Exchanges, dear Ranjit Hoskote, the poet, art writer, said, in the continuation of our questions on the presence of justice in the face of recognized injustice and the predicament of ecological and political refugees, we could perhaps reflect in somewhat Levinas-like mode on our responsibility to the other, on how an ethical responsibility towards another does not always arise from a ground of conventions that is shared and common, but must sometimes be the bridge across unaccountable and sometimes radical difference. This, be the bridge, is the key. And yet, none of us see this. Or if we do, we leave it, some others, to bear the burden of doing. We are too busy burning the very bridges we need to protect. On that dark and moonless night, a restless and invisible moon flitted from one tree to another, seeking absolution. That same night, under a cloak of darkness, the angel shed the weight of his wings, decided to run barefoot, make a hurried escape. Elsewhere, a man punished for something he had not done, condemned to a life of imprisonment, no longer wishing to count the days. The woman sat patiently, waiting at the window, staring at where the moon had once resided, where all that now remained was a black hole in the sky. The only time one is allowed to cry halt is when there is injustice, and one does. The thing is that our sense of self, the one that is capital and is capital too, is of a thinking being that is capable of analysis on many planes simultaneously, a philosophical reinventor of one's own positions, so as not to be frozen in time and become a willing slave to circumstance or philosophy. On the contrary, philosophy teaches us fluidity. I never subscribed to labels. They're all temporary phenomena, nor did I ever have faith in one grand order imposing itself on our world. So, yes, when all that we grew up believing in slipped into a fluid state and turned into something else, the philosophies we espoused also needed to be packed away and be replaced by fresh thinking. We fall back on the intuitive, not just in the way we traverse learning and acquired knowledge, but also in what and how we experience. This is not a position of defeat. The cynicism we so easily accuse ourselves of is actually a virtue. The cynic questions, often inadvertently, sometimes out of mistrust, but always from a position of the humane. I speak of the cynical as a challenge to the status quo. One often rues the fact that the science, or if you will, the art of questioning, is no longer in vogue. It is in danger of dying out in this nameless time. The time we inhabit is the time that in turn devours us, reduces us to a state of loss, strips us of our ability to question. There are many that remain stuck in a past that confronts them. What will happen now that our stories are being erased, denied even as we bear witness? What of the future that is being aggressively appropriated? What may lie beyond this unfolding of events that may one day be labeled as history? The rewriting of our textbooks, for example, the act of erasure, when it is a unilateral act, lacks ethics. It must be clarified that this is an unethical act if it is not the decision of all who are responsible for creating that textbook. Erasure must be the joint action of those affected by it. We are already seeing a dwindling desire to learn, study history among our young, helpless as those other bystanders at another cannibal time. These very same among us who now this moment connect with what was or what ought to have been, not what is. For what is comes with the burden of a shifting, inquiring, evolving set of thoughts, positions, ideologies of the time. And yes, philosophy in its unadulterated form. It also comes with having to reorient yourself constantly. Examine the self every time there is something of a crisis. Philosophy does not teach us to play safe. The chair that is no longer the same chair that it was a moment ago, and so on. Our friend Rumla Thapa once said this to me: an emergency in which all one's loudly spoken sentences are reduced to utter silence. There is no communication. I wonder if it would not be more effective to set aside activities of resistance and of demanding that everyone should do so, and instead focus on being oneself as a form of resistance, if you will, not living a competitive life, but rather a gentle one, with a concern that values ethics and compassion and such like. Could this be an alternative way of life that gives one some inner courage at least? I replied, in many ways, Gandhi, were he alive, would have arrived at this value, this life of compassion, beyond non-violence as resistance, or even alongside. Valuing the ethical is an act of extreme courage, and your suggestion about inner courage in itself suggests the clandestine. I choose to equate inner with hidden, as in deliberately so. not just outwardly courageous, but also full of this inner hidden resisting strength that makes it that much more tactical for us in our battle against fascism. What you say resonates with the question of the nature of the just in this brittle world. What is just and what makes it so? What is the relationship between the just act and one that is its opposite, the unjust? I'm not engaging in word play here. I am specifically seeking a new definition specific to what I call this brittle time, this time of the no logic, this time of lawlessness that is not just the breakdown of law as we knew it, but a deliberate attempt to use the law to suit our current masters. The idea of justice is under attack. What can we as individuals do to defend this breach of what philosophers and historians have called a just society? Last one. This one's on tolerance. And yeah, it's very raw and vulnerable, so bear with me. Here we are then, he said to no one in particular. There was no one there. The last fireflies had taken their bow. His words did not echo the emptiness, flat, hermetic, sealed, and solitary. He spoke again, looking up at the sky, or in the general direction of where the sky had last been. Sort of stage right and up, a slanted view, a sloping sky, descending to the tip of a horizon, painted silver grey, stylized, no real reason, just design whimsy. It did look interesting though, like a stairway or an upside-down slide. You slid backwards each time. The soundscape was insidious, at least that was the brief. The air had to be subtle and in conspiracy with the surreptitious. Artful, if you were on its side, plain cunning, sly, and wily if you weren't anything but honest. Necessary for the scene. Stealth was called for, but without a visibly recognizable instrument, like a body on steroids feeling the tremor, all over, including in your voice, but the mind was alert and sharp and hyper, activity that pulsated, the atmosphere alive, but not with sound, intended sound, yes, not the easily audible kind. Underhand, the space had to be blasted with desolation, white, bright light in your face and cold. Winter, the season of our aging, everlasting henceforth and full of promise. Contradictory, you say. An aging winter full of a future, you mock. A spring, another one. Your greed, your fingers and wrists bruised with the gazing of the rope. You hold on life, fast slipping away, and you want promises. So settle for winter. Make it harsh. I will grant you that, but winter it is. And a smoking one. Mists, fogs, fires, eyes burning and skin dampening. Frosty. Its lonely swirls orchestrate the air around us, choreographed to suggest a vast and monumental barrenness. Here we are then, he said, precise and particular. There never had been anyone, only the lingering glow of receding fireflies. Sensing the light cue, the blasting, the desolation, had scurried away hastily. All that remained were his words, mere wisps in the emptiness. Theatre. The experience of sensing other lives, both lived and imagined, and the elsewhere that inhabits the silences between the spoken word and the hearing one. An audience, of course, hears and listens and follows a sequence of unfolding suspense. But it also senses a parallel, often contrary text, tale, story that remains unspoken. The subtext that is simultaneously linked to the playwright's intent, the actorial interpretation of this perceived intent. There, the actor's ability to articulate, enact, emote, express in audible, therefore timbre, tonality, emotion, words. The split second domestic dailynesses each member of the audience brings to this hearing of the other elsewhere. Both as self-discovery and curiosity. All this in a staged, time-bound environment. The duration of the performance. All this combines to create, form, give a naming to what may be called the unquestioning despair of the everyday. As you, in so many words, suggest, the reader viewer as a trapped being, refusing stubbornly to risk questions, the status quo of this condition of despair. It is also a condition that affects the spirit. Think about the spirit is that it knows the truth of the heart. I do not mean this in a medical manner. I refer to a part of our inner landscape where freedom roams. A space without any kind of world-driven bundish, which is a finer word and a musical one than its English counterpart, bondage. This roaming sends signals of well-being to the heart and makes the mind see things with great clarity. This process of seeing, viewing, triggered by a feeling of creative well-being is what we sometimes sense as our spirit. The spirit is a doer, one that is an instinctive opposition to its mirror opposite, the non-doer. The doing and the non-doing, as in this context specific to you, the individual self. It is not to be confused with providing or doing one's duty or caring for others at all cost, a self we often neglect. For example, some of us spend a lifetime for others. This is a fine and amazing way of being human, but it does build a certain anxiety that accumulates, layer after layer of providing at the cost of one's own well-being. Maybe I am not advocating a philosophy of selfishness, just trying to explore this business of the levels of spirits, high, low, middling. You have, after so much hard work, created, carved, etched out a creative space for yourself. This is good. You are now trying to create another space, one that rejects the safe and the protected. But this comes at a price. It sometimes makes us low in spirit. And yet, we are merely doing what women and men of great wisdom have advocated over the years. Live also for our inner being amidst the chaos of our other lives, not by neglecting or seeking a self-imposed exile, as the Indian sages of old used to do, but by doing for our own inner well-being that which we are hoping will give us strength, peace, period. I offer you creativity as a form of resistance. Another thing we instinctively do when we are lowly in spirit is to resist. We must not. Let the low do what it does. Let it attempt to drown you. It is okay. It will eventually ebb if you allow yourself to remain in a state of stillness. Do not fight it. It will tire itself soon enough. And you will feel all the better for it. For you will have seen into the heart of despair. The darkest part of our being is inhabited with immense light. As when, for example, someone, a stranger or a friend, actually hears what I photograph or finds what I write to be close to music. It is very touching. Music as sound that grows out of words made invisible, that which leaves traces behind. We gather these traces into notes. Music. We create to resist. Here's what I wrote after seeing a vast body of the painter Basilitz's work. This man, bringing alive the lucid, lying dormant inside one, like an entire Iliad, or the other one, Odyssey, an ongoing chant inside your head, interrupting the obvious and the mundane, guiding inspiration, second nature, fine-honed instinct, intuition by any other name, or labels should you need any, even as the artist unfolds his curatorial vision, experiencing memory as it appears, takes shape, makes manifest like a perceived truth, one we can both believe and remold or sculpt in a manner that makes it our truth, one we can rely upon or shed depending on the circumstance of our thinking selves at that moment of appearance, a moment of apparent clarity, like seeing things through a third eye, worn proudly like a good luck charm, or simply as clairvoyance, or like Cassandra, despairing at the vision, the ability to unmask the future, even as it layered its entire being with makeup, sometimes for the pleasure of understanding what lies in the viewing. Often the breathlessness of the view is pleasure enough, is it not? Being out of breath is not always about having lost the battle. It is also a sign of desire. Rush, the lack, the want. The only way of seeing is through the blindness that faith wears, often like a mask, the kind that refuses to be ripped off and reveal the truth beneath. Then again, does it really matter if it is your truth or someone else's? The artist, the viewer, the creator and the creator locked in combat, dust, sweat, grime, mutual devotees in an endless bout of wrestling. The lure of walking into a living landscape of possibility, especially if no one else has trampled that way before, is exhilarating. Probe memory that one digs around, carefully isolating the fact from its shadow. Fiction. Or is it the other way round? In the process, the mind makes many points, items of interest for a future of delving. Lists, if you're a meticulous maker of lists, often the impressions that flit at rapid missing-link speed during the course process act of dig-delve result in a memorizing that is intuitive and essential. And yes, in an effort to reveal all that is concealed, the probing has to be both courteous and delicate and deliberate. All of this could take a lifetime of deduction. The apparent dailiness of facts as they reveal themselves may appear to be ordinary, but the ordinary adds up and often results in an exemplary gathering of multiple layers of deeply delve-salvaged fact, or fictionalized fact disguised as someone's truth over very long time spans and under so many different skies, spread over centuries, and yet some things don't appear to change, almost remain unpolished and in a state best described as raw, like feelings that appear of lesser consequence and yet seem to occupy our interest. Beyond the emotions that feeling inspire, what is often restored by way of thought becomes visibly stronger than all that is lost, forgotten, unremembered, as in deliberately erased from memory. Loss as it manifests itself when personified as remembrance is also something that interests me, especially if it is accompanied by us quietly picking up the pieces unquestioningly. But then the pieces themselves are often individual mystifications or puzzles in need of solving. It's a race, the writing of what I need to say before it erases itself from my mind, accelerating the forgetting even as I write. There is a no man's land between remembrance and its opposite, forgetting, the slippery limbo where everything falls apart. I wonder what it is. The moment of writing, the actual millisecond of impact when the fingertips strike the keys, hammering the alphabet into shape, letter by letter, forming words, words that gradually find their way through the fog, the sculpting of meaning from a seemingly sparse beginning, empty, devoid of sense, as you and I know it, barren, a terrain that is neither familiar nor inhabited, unknown, undiscovered, untraveled. And yet you will explore it. You must. You crave, therefore you carve a path through the desert, through the forest, through the mountain, through the dust storms, through the landslides, as you walk. Sometimes you hear a whistle, like a train engine ahead of you, like someone left an echo behind, its hands tied and mouth gagged, muffled. Somehow it managed to free itself. And what you're hearing may be a plea for help, or behind you, over your shoulders at a distance, always at a distance, as if from afar, growing nearer, therefore rising in volume. You could be on a train track, or so you think, the ground beneath your feet strewn with the small rocks, large pebbles. The track themselves are more imagined than seen, no sun to glint on the metal. So unless you go down on your knees and crawl, which you're prepared to do, reaching, stretching your arms to the sides to feel the cold metal, you're not sure of the tracks, but they're there in your mind. Remember also that there is a horizon, distant, concealed by the fog, the one that resides in the space between the hammer and the chisel. The tools you're about to use to sculpt, carve, make your way, to write yourself into the horizon. That remains elusive till you get to it, but you know it, as does the horizon, that it is invisible, will remain out of reach, out of touch. It will not happen. You're getting to each other. Often it is the other way round. The horizon has the urge to get to you, find its way home, through language, through words that were carefully strewn in the desert, forest, mountain, dust storm, landslides you have already written into being. After all, what is the horizon but a part of your imagination? It survives because you give it birth. Your words breathe life into it and give it appearance. Yes, your words. They lend it the color of the sun and the moon, the day and the night, the rain and the snow. You and the horizon, rushing headlong towards each other, you become the horizon. The horizon becomes you. Learning the virtue of staying close to one's belief and one's practice. Not easy this. Often the two stray from each other. Visually, it is akin to looking at the illusion of motion, the rubber-like elasticity of parallel train tracks, almost appearing to merge, although growing apart, a repetitive cycle that only ends when you turn your mesmerized gaze away. I speak in particular of tolerance, not only over the large political and humanitarian issues that concern nations and individuals of power, who have the influence of changing the course of history, but also in our daily lives where we tend to be short-fused and devoid of this quality of the tolerant, thinking beings, writers, poets, filmmakers, artists, those that fall into the category we label as intellectual. How do we negotiate their tolerance? Or should I say, intolerance over small issues? This disregard of the fine virtue of courtesy. Where do we draw the line between I refuse to suffer fools, and this is not a matter of ideological life and death, so let it pass? One tends to slot people into a classification of the intellect, as in those that we rank as nearer our own perceived levels of intellect and ability to articulate thought, and those that may be perfectly wonderful people, but do not appear to keep pace with our standards of what we call high-minded beings. I am aware that this is not some form of arrogance or snobbery. It exists, often like squatters a landlord is unable to get rid of, as against paid tenants who have our blessings to inhabit, cohabit our common intellectual landscapes, or those that we see of the same class, of intellect as ourselves. The former are always, almost always, taken to task for doing their best because their best is never enough. The latter, on the other hand, had to do their best effortlessly, and so never get pulled up, chided, rebuked in quite the same way. I find this difficult to accept. We are quick to cause hurt. We often say things and move on, hurtful sentences, not looking back to see the effect of our trampling. It is the little hurts that add up over time. Makes me feel that sometimes the wisdom that begets silence is indeed worthy of its name. The surprise that an unfolding history as it records itself has in store for us are nothing compared to the shocks we get from each other, each human other. The pettiness, the ensuing melancholy, and the matchlessness or misfitness of human beings, of nature at its mean best. I find this too difficult to accept. And I shall end with this little fable. It had begun over something trivial, like the stars bumping into each other. Because the moon had lost its way behind the thick clouds, or the layer of toxic dust that had wiped the shine of the North Star, or perhaps it could have been that the sun had overslept, failing to wake up when it should have. This led to a late dawn, which meant that the stars had to patrol longer, all the while trying hard to stay awake and twinkle. There is also the rumor that the moon had refused to budge, sulking, till the fox had reluctantly agreed to jump over it, thereby keeping a fuming sun waiting, its face red in anger. Older and wiser, the woman who had helped stitch the Milky Way had another story. The sky had been ravished, torn asunder by a pair of thunderbolts vying for its attention, a serious accusation if true. It could lead to at least 10 years of exile, by which time the bolts would have lost their voice, become feeble and without strength, and therefore vulnerable. It was also in the realm of possibility that the planets, Mars and Jupiter and Mercury, had conspired to take over the Earth, but had failed to do so, unable to reach a consensus on who would lead the brave new order after victory. And do not forget that through all this bickering over futile disputes, the clocks of the world had struck work, refusing to tick, their small and big hands frozen at whatever time they had decided to go on strike, unionizing themselves against the unfair practices of the watchmakers, the ones who crafted pendulums made of cheap brass, passing them off as the finest metal. This led to a crisis, forcing time to stop, leading to a serious problem. Nobody could move forward or backwards. In fact, the realization of this movement in itself was not fathomed. The sensation of time passing had come to a halt. The clocks had indeed struck a fatal blow. And to think it had all begun with something trivial, involving a few stars in the sky. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you. That was wonderful. While putting these two words together, justice and tolerance, I was reminded of John Rawls' theory of justice. There again, he teases one idea, but not really explores that idea. That is, what happens when the intolerant sect invokes the idea of tolerance to perpetuate their intolerance? That was a question which Rawls poses, but he never actually answers that. He leaves it as a teaser. And in the post-Trump era and in the post-disinformation era, this idea of how to deal with intolerance sect invoking idea of tolerance to perpetuate tolerance becomes a major concern. And we can actually answer using fable. But if we are not going to use fable, and if I'm going to use non-fiction, How am I going to deal with this idea?
I don't know, except it has to be individually tackled. So, can have it. Yeah, I think I think in this age of misinformation, as you said, and fake news, this distance, the sort of so-called distance or distinction between fiction and non-fiction, in many cases now become very confused, right? And when you're talking in terms of how, if I am propounding the idea of tolerance, but I'm being intolerant about your understanding and acceptance of it, um, that doesn't serve the purpose. So I've learned the hard way very personally to often look at things through my own lens and practice a certain kind of way of being. It has to be an acquired skill. It's not easy because, particularly in today's world, we're all at the edge of sort of slipping into anger at any given moment. And I don't just mean the pressures of trying to um, create a livelihood for ourselves, but also to survive the times and to be not just as I talk about a certain kind of bystander. So you're actually pushed towards being more and more the opposite of tolerance these days. And because these words have almost become unfashionable, I'm speaking in publishing terms of, say, compassion. I can see people tuning off. What am I talking of? It could be something simple during the pandemic, for example. When everything came to a stop. Nothing was happening. Paper, printing, shifting, freighting, everything came to a standstill. So what was I doing? I had friends who were not authors that I had published, but other publishers had. Someone reached out and said, all we have is technology, so let me do mailers for you for my 40,000 mailing list. So you reached out in a certain kind of way. Well, you weren't expecting anybody to spend money, which nobody had. So I'll give you a very small example, but this didn't necessarily result in everybody being compassionate and reaching out to each other. It was just like a one-off thing that somebody initiated without a quid pro quo. And the thing about tolerance is this business of quid pro quo. Don't expect it back. You have to practice your way of being in today's world, right? And that is, I think, the lesson that one can learn from it. I don't have for you a kind of methodological point by point answer for this. But I think it's something that we have to consciously arrive at because it's easier to be the opposite.
See, during the course of your talk, you also use the word resistance. How can we reconcile idea of tolerance and resistance together? Is tolerance and resistance are essentially pitting one against the other, or they can coexist?
I think they coexist for me in the sense that it creates a certain framework. When you talk, or we've had this conversation once on an exchange about this business of how to be specifically as a publisher and we as in the collective publishing in this country resist the times and the pressures, right? I may be in a state of Bengal where at the moment it suits the presiding deity to resist the central forces, so you kind of feel safe, but you don't know when she will flip. So Delhi, on the other hand, at the moment, all our friends, except the independents, except the Zubans and the Speaking Tigers, all the major publishing houses are doing legal edits. So in the old days, you as an author would get a copy edit. Now you get a copy edit, you get a legal edit to prove what you're saying, who said this, where is the link, where's the YouTube. It's become so there's a lot of self-censorship, right? Which means that the purpose is already served to frighten you in a certain way. I, on the other hand, believe that till you're physically stopped, because make no mistake, from now on you're going to be physically stopped. So if you're physically stopped into doing your work, then you don't have a choice, then you cope with it the best way you can or not. Till then, self-censorship is not on. So your way of resisting there is to not preempt, you know, they come to a halt. You have to keep, that's what I connected it with saying that you have to keep doing. You don't have to scream from rooftops, but you have to resist. Even recently in the art world, there was a great division and confusion because there was there were friends on both sides of the divide who were involved in an art exhibition which supported our Prime Minister's radio program, right, celebrating its 100th episode. And I had, because I've been around for 342 years, people were ringing me up and saying, what should we, how, this is a friend, etc. I said, you can't point fingers. At this moment, nobody knows the compulsions of each individual. Focus instead on what you would do when the time comes, because the time will come for each one of us at the most certain kind of way. That is when you decide, are you going to accept it? Are you going to resist it? Are you going to give in? Those choices are all open to you. But to just point fingers at friends who, for whatever reasons, have participated in a publishing event or an art event or whatever, right? So, I mean, most of my thinking is under fire and therefore very vulnerable. So when people ask me questions, often doesn't have precisely thought out answers. My feeling is that resistance is a very vital part of what we do as creators of anything, any kind of writing, art, all of that. I am, for example, in an ongoing strange correspondence with a German writer, right? This man doesn't speak English and he doesn't use the email. The last 8, 10 years, I've been publishing his books, which are 600-page, very difficult to translate things. We write these 30, 40-page letters to each other. Each time he writes something, it goes to a literary translator who charges £100 per 1,000 words. So each letter costs 700-800 euros. I do the same. So it's German to English, English to German, and we have this thing going. And in 2017, he sends me a letter where he says, I've decided not to be a part of this business of publishing, which I find intolerant. And he gives me a list of reasons which, if you and I were speaking them, would sound like chest beating and just complaining about something. There was a kind of sincerity to it. So he said, I will stop being published, but I will continue to write for my drawer. So my alarm bell went off because he was from East Berlin. Drawer meant clandestine, so he was going to, it was that sort of a thing. So I told him why I disagreed with it, but respected his right as the creator to say, no, don't do it. I'll write, but not for you, for my own personal whatever, right? Like music, you do your practice every day, the riyaz. So he wanted to do that, but didn't want to be a part of the business, the marketplace of world publishing. All I told him was, of course, you're welcome, but that's what I feel. And that I'm very close to a German publisher, so I will have to tell them this. He said, no, I wanted you to know, I will tell them now. And we carry on, and it's been 7 years. He's written thousands of pages, but he doesn't want to be. So there's this kind of opting out, which I see as a form of resistance, right? Or the fact that for 20 years people were telling me that I should be publishing my writing, because I write every day. 2 lines, 20 lines, 30 lines, whatever. And it didn't even occur to me that I am a hotshot publisher that can publish books of my own. But it happened organically, with somebody else discovered it and found it. And it's great joy. But what I'm saying is sometimes it's the process of doing or being the way you wish to be in an otherwise different world.
Before you open up for questions, I have one more question. This is one of the books you published is by Ramila Thapar on dissent. Was there any specific reason to take idea of dissent for that essay?
Sorry, was
So
there a
the
specific reason?
books you have published is
Yeah,
not purpose dissent.
dissent. Yeah.
Was a particular compelling reason to look at dissent.
Only retrospectively, because everything I do at that moment looks like an urgent need at that moment. So if I'm having a conversation with somebody that I have over 800,000 words in letters, I think we were talking about something, and then she'd given a little lecture online. And I said, you should develop this because this, in today's world, we need your voice to be heard. And every time you publish, it's a little pinprick in the eyes of the so called perceived masters. And she developed it, and then the pandemic happened. And we published it at the height of the pandemic. And it actually sold 8,000 copies, which was also, which is one of our rare publishing successes because the nature of what we publish. It's like often if you look at that list, nobody believes that it sells in the millions, and it doesn't. But it's necessary to do it. You can't be a publisher which does 60-70% of the popular because your heart is in the serious and you cross fund. Doesn't work. You have to build a corpus, a wave of the serious literary, political, philosophical thought, and slowly it finds its way because the market too has a duty to find you.
Now I'm opening it. Questions, please.
I think everybody should just go and have some tea. This has been
Yeah.
things.
No, we'll have someone. Here. Javed.
See the kind of injustice that we see. How do you kind of reconcile that in a given existence, the need for an outward reform?
You're doing it in the sense that your urge may start in a hidden space that you wish to resist. But you also have the wish to survive and to be able to do battle regularly. So you do it in the different ways that you have outlined for yourself in the world. So, for example, I would do it with publishing. I would do it with my history, my Peaceworks program. My Peaceworks program started 20 years ago when Godra happened. Till then, we were exactly what you just said, which is our politics was only visible in what we did rather than be at the barricades. My wife and partner, Anu, was always at the barricades, but I was kind of shy of that. Not that I didn't want to stand up and be grounded, but it doesn't seem to be, wasn't a fear thing. But that was the point. The Goza was a point where I wanted to stand in the middle of the street, like those North Indian Rudalis, and beat my chest in self flagellation. So I turned that into something called Peaceworks, which basically took the arts to school kids in India, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, because we all look at the same historical event. That in those days you were allowed to go there and do that. And for years we did that, which now became a History for Peace event, where you work with teachers. Slowly these people have stopped coming, they don't get visas, but we every year there are about 30, 40 red flagged citizens, not just the Romulas, but all sorts of individual lawyers. All of these people, scholars, get together in Calcutta on the idea of constitution, the idea of resistance, the idea of justice, the idea of culture, nationalizing, all that. I remember in 2019 when we ended the idea of the Constitution Conference, I had a visit from two people from the FCRA Home Ministry. And very young, courteous people who wanted all kinds of information, and we gave it to them. And I took them to their own website and said, "Look, you have all of this information twice a year from us." They said, "Sorry, sir, we have to do this." So we gave it to them. 2 days later, two people from Kashmir who were in the conference were arrested because 5th of August happened, right? So you negotiate if you look at the nature of the books we do, even those history tracks and stuff like that, all of these get slammed online by a whole army of trolls and so on and so forth. You participate and you stand up and you say what you wish to say. And I think, having said that, there are moments when you feel the same despair with which you're asking that question. You feel inadequate, that you haven't been able to actively do enough.
There, please.
Nice to see you, Naveen, here at Chennai. I'm very happy to join because you are the one publishing all of the whole publishing industry. You are the one publishing Poland Dark, Buddies, and, and many more like Sartar and everyone. So thanks for thanks for that first of all. And I want to ask you, many people ask these questions. So you publish Roland Barthes, Michel Foucault, Jean-Paul Sartre, and everyone. So, so when did I get from those Western intellectuals? For a society like India, it is multicultural, multilingual. So, what the purpose of publishing Roland Barthes, Michel Foucault, and everyone at India? What is the scope for them here? Uh, this is a general question we get everywhere here. And I think in, in India and Tamil Nadu, we are talking about one Bharat and Mission for India and everyone. I don't see anywhere.
I'll try in the sense that, first of all, you've just picked out the three popular ones, of which one we don't do, but still, Baths and Burgers and all that. So till 2005, I was a theatre publisher and a cinema publisher and some kind of theoretical cultural anthropology, also performing art and so on and so forth, because I came from the theatre as a lighting designer, and then I wanted to document it. I didn't want them, the only language I was considering was English because I was comfortable in it. And I saw it as a link language because all my theatre practitioner friends, whether they were from Chennai or whether they were from Bombay, often didn't know any other language than English and their own. So we started as a program of translation that would, not because I thought everybody will jump around doing it in English. It was meant to be a service. You go to read it in English, go back to the original if you like it, and so on and so forth. So it was a choice and a decision. In 2005, I was very frustrated by the relationship with the English-speaking West. Traditionally, the American and British West has always told us you buy the right to sell our books, our Toni Morrisons or our Kiefers or our Paul Celans or whatever, but only for the Indian border. Right? I said, why? You have been shouting that this is a globalized world. If my book is as good as yours, and my aesthetics, both editorial and design, what I lack, which you have, is reasonably courteous distribution, which is what you owe your writers. Not sales. You add for visibility, and that you need through this. So I set up something called Seagull Books London Limited in 2005 as an act, a political act in my head, a slightly tongue-in-cheek act where I reversed the trend. It cost me £50 to set it up. It is a legal independent taxpayer entity. It has no offices. It has a chartered accountant. Next year is its 20 years. We have over 600 world right contracts. So that's the basis. To get to your question, what did I wish to publish? Was I going to publish my play scripts from Tamil and Marathi and Gujarati, or was I going to do something else? I chose at that moment, for reasons that even I don't know, to turn to what I grew up reading, which gave me hope, which was a certain kind of European literature. Europe may not be a place of hope in terms of the economics of it, perhaps, but for those of us growing up in the 60s and 70s, it was available on our footpaths because translation worldwide was happening and companies like Rupa were importing them. So we got all the Sats or the Arthurs, right? Or the Vina Bonds. These were all available. We grew up reading them. So when I turned to that, I said, I need to build an international list on which my Indian list will write piggyback because nobody wanted to distribute me as a. So I went to a house called Gallimard in Paris, and I went to a German house called Zurkhan. Why? Because I knew the names from the old books I was to read. So I was familiar with these people. And it was 100 years of South. And I was familiar with the fact that there were films that had never been published by the Americans. So I found my way to three 800-page books by him, which had never been published before. Then I went to the man who was to translate him and paid the fee for it, and he produced them. So that's where it started. And that's all I thought of at that moment, that I wanted European literature to come in. Slowly, we became famous for German. We do 23 languages, Hungarian, Latvian, Arab, Chinese, So it grew. It grew accidentally, not like a plan. It looks like a plan now, but earlier it was just what you responded to. But I don't read all these languages, so what am I responding to? It's a combination of my instinct. When I meet you, a French publisher or Italian publisher, and you give me a 150-page word synopsis, either something has to touch a chord, then I ask for a sample, which I give to a translator and pay to get it read. So it's a process. Often you do it instinctively. Sometimes I've committed books because, and I'm talking of beyond the Baths and the Borgeses, I'm talking of unknown people. If you find two known names, the other 20 you won't know, because I didn't know them either. So I turned to a circle of great translators, and I did something that other publishers didn't do at that time, which is trust them. I asked for wish lists. And I was met with silence because you don't ask translators for wish lists. And slowly it kind of grew into a thing. Now when we look back, in some interesting way, I was asked a similar question at a festival in Italy where I was given some kind of an award. And the woman who had given me the award was actually asking me and telling me, you're very privileged. You publish in the English language, what's the big deal and that kind of stuff. So I knew it was coming from a place of affection. She wanted an answer. But the answer involved the fact that the French and the Germans and the Italians, the French, the Italians, the Germans and the French, all of them work within themselves. The moment they have to go into what they see their lesser known backyard and do something from the Latvians or they can't find translators as their excuse. I find them. So I spoke to her about the fact that I am truly trying to move beyond this border thing. I don't have all the answers. As for the choice of writers, it's just literally a haphazard wish list of what my sense of the human condition is, and the sense of 5 other colleagues who work with me, who also choose what their wish list and what their sense. That's the only common factor. A woman sitting in some village in Austria, why should I publish her? Because in Vishwata Devi's villages and the Bavarian village or Austrian village, there is a kind of resonance of what we call the human condition. I pay the price for it, so I sort of carry on. That is a privilege.
One last question. That's really the last question. Yes, Mr.
So, as an artist myself, I really resonated. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
So, as an artist myself, I very much resonated with something that you said about the thing about spirit is that it molds the truth of our hearts. And you also told us about living for your inner self. And I feel that I want to write for my inner self. I want to write the truth and put it in the world out there. But sometimes as a writer, as someone who wants to make it as a writer in the world, I couldn't deny that. Uh, I couldn't deny that I'm getting engulfed in the noises of the publishing world, where some of them are commercial, and uh, some of them do tell that they don't have an audience for poetry. And what do you think about that? Am I looking at the wrong publishers because they want it to be commercial? And do you think they want me to be like a certain kind of writer because I'm like perhaps looking at the wrong kind of publishers?
I think to some degree, this is a common thing. And from my personal experience, poetry does sell in the sense that we don't have a formal poetry list, but we have over 140 books of poetry. It just happened. How did it just happen? It happened because if I was publishing your prose and you were also doing another poetry, I would automatically do that. It started like that. Because it's 75% a translation project, and it's the range that I can reach out to. There was a wonderful old, dead, and new and fresh poetry available. So it kind of grew. We didn't seek it. It sort of happened organically and so on and so forth. Commercial is not a bad word in the sense that I may appear to be some kind of a mad romantic with all these thoughts and going around sprouting stuff that I still haven't fully explored. But there is a mental math. If I say yes to your book, I'm after 42 years of publishing, I don't need to do anything other than snap my fingers because my 42 years of experience tells me what I could lose. What is my end game if I do your book, right? But having said that, a certain kind of corporate publishing doesn't allow you that freedom because the decision making process is very dependent on an individual book being a profit and loss sheet. The moment that happens, poetry suffers because, in their opinion, fiction or non-fiction of a certain kind, I'm talking the Indian context in particular, sells more than poetry. Now, poetry may sell 3,000 copies, or it may sell 600 copies or 300 copies compared to many more of the others. Therefore, the default setting is to discourage you from submitting something. There's no easy way. You have to keep writing. And as I keep saying, in India, at least, we're very lucky that all of us have a kind of, this whole 6 degrees of separation nonsense. You've met me, so you can easily now reach out at any given moment. I don't mean this as just you, but there's often, if you look around, you'll find ways of getting to publishers. And I'm constantly, even when I'll say no in about 30 seconds because every second extra builds up hope. So if you're saying no, you say it quickly, but my no's are always accompanied by trying to find you a match unless I think that you have given me something that doesn't make any sense to me. So there are lots of people like me, lots of independent publishers who would be open to looking at stuff. Also, at this moment, if you are impatient in the nicest possible way about putting it out there is the social media. Build that up, because that also finds its way to certain kinds of publishing considerations, but poetry does sell.
Thank you, Naveen. Thank you, Naveen, for giving us hope in this, gloom. Thank you for being symbol of hope also.
Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you, everyone. We will mail it.